In the quest for regional dominance, there is a military approach that can attempt to crush a country. This is done with the intention of economic goals, such as trade corridors. This is the story of the Israeli regime, which, backed by the US and its military equipment, has tried to crush the Gaza Strip and Hamas, then Lebanon and Hezbollah, but in vain. The old but not discarded New Middle East, or West Asia, as we call it, may be an aspiration not discarded, but is still being pursued. Yet the US and the Israeli regime failed to learn from their defeats in both Lebanon and the Gaza Strip. There was a time that the Israeli regime is facing an existential threat. That time is now. In today's program, we'll be looking at its losses and where it may be headed to into the future. The Israeli regime has submitted to a ceasefire with Lebanon and Hezbollah, a major defeat for the regime. Could not even invade Lebanon. It couldn't capture a village or town, let alone dismantle Hezbollah. And it has paid a huge price for it. When it comes to the Israeli losses, there's so much, especially the north suffered massive economic infrastructure and property damage. Many of the properties are too expensive for the settlers to return to in terms of the damages incurred. And then you have the genocidal cost. That has continued. Israel's economy, the ceasefire, well, doesn't mean the end of the onslaught. Even if the agreement with Hezbollah holds, the onslaught in Gaza is grinding on while high war costs and mismanagement continue to weigh in on the economy. And the Israeli budget, meanwhile, is suffering because of that. Now, in this program, we'll be covering these topics and more with our guest, Nicholas Kosmatopoulos, who's a politics professor that you see there. And also we have Frank Wright, who will talk about all of this. He's a geopolitical analyst.
I'm Nicholas Kosmatopoulos. I'm an associate professor of politics and anthropology at the American University of Beirut. Thank you for having me on the show. The financial question, the costs of war, is extremely important. These are only the costs that relate to the protection of the population, but if you also add to this budget items, if you add also the immense costs that the Iron Dome has caused, the missiles, the flying of airplanes, I'm not really an economist myself, but I can imagine that this has been a huge black hole in the Israeli budget, state budget. I think there are also other economic losses, such as many businesses.
Let's take a look at some of the stats when it comes to the Israeli losses. The ones standing out the most are the rockets that have been fired into the northern occupied Palestine. Now, Hezbollah conducted 23 operations per day. This clearly shows that this was not a win for the Israeli regime, and those are some of the other facts that you see there. Well, the losses of northern occupied Palestine are pretty significant. Material damage, over $1 billion. Property damage, pretty steep at over $400 million. And then you have indirect damages coming in at over $1 billion also. The Israeli Tax Authority reported over 9,000 buildings and over 7,000 vehicles were either damaged and or destroyed.
The latest ICC ruling, the arrest warrant against Netanyahu and Gallant, I think it's a major issue. This is also part of the list of losses and defeats and disadvantages that the latest Israeli aggression and genocidal attacks in Gaza and Lebanon have brought to itself. On on the basis of this discussion, you see also the reactions in the domestic scene of Israel. You see some, especially the far right, being very angry about the agreement with Lebanon. They want to continue the war despite the fact that even their own people practically are against that war, because much of their military has been weakened, and their own soldiers defy orders to fight in the north.
We're now demonstrating because we've seen that a ceasefire is possible. There's a ceasefire in the north. It's time for a ceasefire in the south. 101 hostages are waiting for 418 days for Netanyahu to make the right decision. Ceasefire now and bring them home now.
Time now to take a look at some social media posts, but first, a developing story. Trump has threatened 100% tariff on BRICS countries if they pursue creating a new currency. He has said the idea that the BRICS countries are trying to move away from the dollar while we stand by and watch, well, that's over. He said we require a commitment from these countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs and should expect to say goodbye to selling into the wonderful US economy. Sounds like there's going to be trade wars brewing with some BRICS countries at a minimum. All right, our first social media post. Israel does not understand the word ceasefire. The US does not do diplomacy. Lebanon ceasefire was a public relations stunt and an acknowledgement that neither Israel nor the US can defeat Hezbollah. If the US can't defeat Hezbollah, how can it take on China? Well, it can't, but it can create untold human suffering in pursuit of empire and colonial aims. True Thanksgiving spirit. Well, that is the whole issue when it comes to the Israeli regime. This is economic device take, and also its main backer of the U.S. If Israel has not succeeded in the Gaza Strip or in Lebanon, how does it even think that it can take on other powers, such as Iran? Well, as for the U.S., quick question, when was the last time the U.S. even won a war? Its defeats in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan prove this, not to mention its maximum pressure policy defeat against Iran. Next up, take a look at this video where it's describing 70% of Hezbollah's UAV stockpile and most of the cruise missile inventory of Hezbollah's aerial unit. 127 were destroyed yesterday. 150 plus UAV launching positions, approximately 30% of the units, command centers, approximately 20 weapons storage facilities containing UAVs and cruise missiles, and approximately 4 UAV and cruise missile manufacturing workshops. All right, our response, yes, it is true that Hezbollah has lost a lot of its missiles and military capabilities, but to write it off, well, these are some of the missile capabilities of Hezbollah's firepower and missiles, which numbered over 100,000. Now, we ask you, if Hezbollah fired over 8,000 rockets and 23 operations per day, that was its average, it doesn't even come close to it pointing to a dwindling missile arsenal.
Well, Israeli media itself is reporting that the ceasefire is a victory for Netanyahu of sorts, because, of course, the tremendous losses which have been inflicted in the Israeli economy in one dimension. Reports late in October suggested that in the coming year, Israel may see a loss of over $100 billion. There will be further costs in terms of restoration, because many of those buildings that those people lived in have been destroyed or converted for use by the IDF. So the costs of this are going to mount. Whilst the Israeli press has been very good so far at reporting on multiple crises inside Israel, recent moves to isolate and indeed disconnect Haaretz and de-recognise it by the Israeli government may see a further tightening of reporting from within Israel.
It's a good time to review some of the highlights there by our guest, Frank. He indicated the Israeli losses of the genocidal war on the Gaza Strip and also on Lebanon together exceeded over $100 billion. He also indicated the failure of the residents of the northern occupied Palestine to return to their homes as promised by the Israeli regime. He pointed to restoration costs, and that's a good point, especially, he said, given that many buildings were actually converted for both the U.S. and also the IF regime forces. Well, all these point to the regime's failures.
It's not just the financial, but also the tremendous human cost, which I think stands at over 43,000 casualties now, whose ferocity and severity have been attested to by people like Dr. Mark Perlmutter, a Jewish-American surgeon, whose return had presented evidence that children and toddlers are routinely executed by sniper fire, for example, as well as women, and healthcare workers. So apart from the human cost and the financial cost, due to the habits of Western media, we might say, we typically do not experience the viewpoint that is presented in Israel's own media itself, which for months now has strongly suggested that Netanyahu is pursuing these conflicts simply to stay in power. The return of the hostages would remove one of his reasons for the war and would bring the war to a close, and which would see him then have to face charges, potentially, but also have to explain in an October the 7th inquiry why he did not heed warnings about the attacks themselves. Now, former prime ministers have said that Netanyahu does not want this inquiry because he was warned precisely of October the 7th.
It's time now to take a look at some news with an economic flavor in our Info News section. First up, Trump and tariffs. That's right, before coming into office, officially he has upped the ante on it, vowing massive taxes on goods from Mexico, Canada, and China starting from day one. He has said, quote, on January 20th, I will charge Mexico and Canada a 25% tariff on all products coming into the U.S. and its ridiculous open borders. That's how he characterized it. He said this tariff will remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl and all illegal aliens, stop this invasion of our country. Next, well, let's take a look at a reaction. We picked this entry because China has had one to Trump tariffs. It said that it could devalue the yuan to spite Trump, and such a move would be a response to these U.S. tariff hikes by Trump. U.S. import taxes on Chinese goods will be raised to 60% from the current 20% mark. Fresh levies will also hit imports from Malaysia and Vietnam as well. Now you have U.S. tariffs to cost jobs as a result once and when this takes into effect. Mexico has warned Trump proposed tariffs to cost 400,000 U.S. jobs. Mexico has emphasized interconnectivity of economic ties with the U.S. and the mutual threat of tariffs to be the reasons, citing if there are U.S. tariffs, Mexico would also raise the tariffs. Then a process that has been going on for quite some time and has to deal with de-dollarization, in particular when it comes to Russia and Iran, who have now completed the de-dollarization process between the two countries. They've completely shifted to trade in their national currencies. And this will allow travelers from both countries to use their domestic debit cards for purchases in either Iran or in Russia. It's time now to take a look at a special investigation. South Africa's illegal gold miners are locked in an underground standoff with police in South Africa. Workers at illegal gold mines like these are known as zamas, meaning one who takes a chance in the Zulu language. We looked at this, of which it expanded more, saying inside South Africa's ruthless gang-controlled gold mines, that's what's happening. Where South Africa's mining industry has gone into decline over the last 3 decades. Many of these have gone on to become the zama-zamas at the abandoned mines. Now, this is an industry that has spiraled out of control with mafia-like gangs running it, an illegal industry that involves people of different races and classes. This is the in-depth section of the program. The war toll on the Israeli regime from its war with Lebanon proves how the regime was forced into defeat since it could not achieve its stated goal, the return of its settlers into northern occupied Palestine. But the economic costs and damages incurred as a result from both wars is quite staggering. The war costs become clear in this graph. First, the total coming in at $67.3 billion, the one in the yellow that you see there. No surprise that that is so much that it has accumulated because of the fact that you have daily costs that have hit $133 million. These are no matters to be laughing at in terms of how high these factors are. The one factor missing here is what about Israel's cash or savings on hand? Well, the Southern Front communities, they have not been spared either. The war has incurred $337.5 million in damages when it comes to the communities near the Gaza Strip. The central part of occupied Palestine, it has also suffered significant losses. For example, a single missile in an area by the name of Had HaSharon damaged 2,000 apartments, $150 million worth altogether. And of course, that is where the guest comes in, of which we have our first guest, Nicholas Kosmatopoulos, who's a political professor, giving us this answer.
All this constant emergency situation that the Israeli military operations and the Israeli attacks have introduced to the country. I can imagine that the settlers and the citizens of Israel are not happy with this. They don't feel safe. The promise of the Netanyahu and its government to keep them safe has never materialized, not even in the north, not even lately in places like Haifa or Tel Aviv. So there's a lot that went wrong in terms of what the government has done. So I could imagine that this is in their own interest to stop the wars.
All right, that was Nicholas Kosmatopoulos. Taking a look at the other factors that show that Israel has incurred losses, we're looking at the economic shock and where it has come in terms of the indirect effects. Those are actually 90% of the story here. Investment, for example, productivity growth, labor market disruptions, these are all losses for the Israeli regime. The war cost that has been accrued at this point from the year 2023 through the year 2025, which is an estimate, it has been a figure of $55.6 billion, the actual figure being that, up to $120 billion. Now, what does that mean? That means that you're looking at a negative 10% contraction when it comes to Israel's economy, or at the most, if we're looking at $120 billion of cost, that's a 20% contraction, which obviously is quite high when it comes to Israel's economy. Well, the Israeli GDP, it was projected to grow 3% for the year 2024. That was the projection. But at this point, we're looking at 1.5%, the actual GDP growth for this year, which is coming to an end in the calendar year. The credit downgrades are a big factor, of which you have the three major agencies, Fitch, S&P, and Moody's, to have all downgraded Israel, which makes it very hard for Israel to be able to actually borrow money. To get a reaction on that, we have our other guest rejoining us now, and the comments that he gave is quite startling. Frank Wright, a geopolitical analyst, said this.
If Israel is interested in peace and coexistence, then it should. But unfortunately, it appears that the leadership is dedicated to a strategy of permanent emergency. If you have a permanent state of emergency, of course, you have a compelling reason to continue United States financial and military aid, on which Israel increasingly relies, having suffered, according to Le Monde, damages up to $100 billion as a result of its recent campaigns over the last year. So yes, I think Israel is at an existential moment.
Hello, and welcome to the Quick Tech section. I'm Kiarash Purnamati. Israel's economy is being battered due to the genocidal onslaught it is waging in the Gaza Strip. There's no doubt about that. One sector, however, that continues to suffer immensely and has recently suffered a huge setback is Israel's tech sector. First, Israel's tech is the most contributor to Israel's economy. The tech sector accounts for about a fifth of Israel's gross domestic product, or the GDP. Half of exports and about a quarter of total revenues generated from salaried employees, income taxes, and company taxation. But the tech sector has nosedived, a process which began even before the genocidal war began back on October the 7th. Investment in the sector began to show cracks, and it had to deal with the judicial reforms, which resulted in massive anti-cabinet demos. Now, with the genocide in its 14th month and after enduring a war with Lebanon, the sector continues to lose investors. Investments in tech startups slumped 46% in the last quarter of 2023 as foreign funds shy away from reinvestment in local markets, a figure which peaked at 60%. The Israeli cabinet also continues to struggle on the battlefield, unable to fill in the adequate numbers needed to continue the onslaught. This has continued to put pressure on the workforce of the tech sector. At one point, the Israeli army mobilized more than 350,000 reserve IOF regime forces. Now, after more than 1 year, many remain in uniform. The absence of key personnel in tech sector has damaged startups' day-to-day operations, as well as their ability to attract foreign investors and raise funding. And finally, what has been a nail in the coffin of the tech sector has been the mobile and, a smaller degree, the cell phone explosions that occurred in Lebanon. Given the nature of what has been described as a terroristic act, which involves tech to some degree, Israel's tech sector has taken a massive hit. Called sinister tech, the pager explosions have dealt another blow to Israel's tech sector. Israel's consumer tech terrorism across Lebanon was seen as a terrifying new global threat. And that does it for this Quick Tech section. If you have any comments or questions, contact us. Contact info is coming up. I'm Kiarash, and I'll see you next week.
The Israeli regime, backed by the U.S., is on a military adventure now in Syria, which happened the day that there was a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah. The continuation of this war will surely continue to mount costs for the regime, and the U.S. will be there to back it. Israeli citizens, meanwhile, remain hostage to the regime officials.